Welcome to a very special episode of the ACS Cricket Podcast. We're joined today by a man who will be very familiar to our members. John Ward, a long-time member himself, contributes a daily post to the ACS forum under the title 100 Years Ago. It does what it says on the tin and is one reason among many why those of you who aren't yet ACS members ought to consider joining us. I thought we might begin with a fairly obvious question. What happened 100 years ago today?
I'm using the First Class Cricket Matches 1924 book that's produced by ACS. This invaluable series which really increased my knowledge of cricket history. It started in about 1980 and they have covered right through to the 1950s. I've got the 1923-24 booklet in front of me now. And on the 8th of December, actually, there were no first-class matches overseas. Actually, my 100 years ago series is in temporary suspension at the moment. It'll be on again soon, but with the overseas season, matches are pretty sporadic, but they were in those days. So I only do it now and again during the English winter. Just finished in India was a match between Hindus and Muslims. And they had their tournament. Match finished 100 years ago. The only players perhaps that people may have heard of real fame, C.K. Naidu played in that match. He had a massive first-class career. It started in 1916 and finished in 1963 when he was 68 years old. And he scored 44 in Hindu's innings victory. There was also, I think he became later Professor D.B. Deodar, playing for the Hindus. He lived to be 101, and in this match he scored 4 runs. Neither of them bowled, but it was an easy victory for the Hindus.
Marvelous. Longevity seems to be a bit of a theme, appropriately, when we're looking back over 100 years. Now let's talk about you. You don't go quite as far back as 1923, but let's hear a bit about your family background, etc. When and where were you born? I understand that despite hailing from Yorkshire, cricket entered your life pretty late.
I came from a non-sporting family, actually, though my father did have some cricket interest. And we came out to Southern Rhodesia, as it then was, in 1958. It was my 6th year. I started school, I went to school in Leeds, where I was born, for about 6 months before we came out here. Being born in Leeds, well, as they say, a Yorkshireman is somebody who's born within the sound of bilboes, and so I qualify for that almost literally. My first home was, I think, less than about a mile or so from Headingley Cricket Ground. We came out as a family in 1958, went to school in Salisbury, Southern Rhodesia, as it then was. And they tried to get me interested, but my parents didn't play at all, but they expected me to. And we did occasionally have a bit of fun cricket with my father, very rudimentary, in the backyard back home. But I didn't fancy it at school. I didn't fancy the hard ball, and neither did a lot of the other boys then. We started, I think, at about the age of about 8, and that was a bit too early for most of us with the hard ball. The teacher in charge didn't seem specially interested, especially in people like me. Having Asperger's syndrome, one of the fairly common trait is that we're rather uncoordinated physically. And with non-sporting parents and very little training at home, I was in about the lowest category there. So I gave it up as soon as I could. I did get some news from my father, though, about cricket. He did talk about it occasionally. When he was a schoolboy just before the Second World War, his hero was Bill Bowes, actually. and he went to Headingley Cricket Ground a few times and saw him play. He didn't remember much about anything else that was there. When I asked him once, he said he must have seen Headley Verity bowl, but he didn't remember it at all. He hadn't really any memories apart from Bill Bowes, the tall, gangling, bespectacled fast bowler who somehow won his admiration. As far as my memory of cricket interest and news is concerned, the first recollection I have of any cricket news was in 1963, when I remember seeing a newspaper headline saying that 4 Rhodesians had been chosen for the South African Cricket Tour of Australia. For a matter of interest, Colin Bland, Tony and David Pithie, Joe Partridge. I occasionally followed a bit of cricket news after that. I don't really remember MCC tour of South Africa in 64, 65, but the Worcestershire team on part of their world tour did visit Rhodesia then, and I remember hearing about that, but hadn't any interest or any real knowledge about it. I remember 1965-66 odd things about the England tour of Australia, captained by Mike Smith, whom I had the pleasure of meeting actually some years ago when he was president of the ACS. A very nice man, I liked him very much. And I just remember he was captain of the team then. They opened with Boycott and Barber. Maybe the alliteration helped me to remember that. I remember Doug Walters scoring 2 centuries at the age of 19, which I thought was pretty fantastic, against England in the first 2 test matches. And that's about it. 1966, the year I turned 14, I began to get a bit more knowledge and interest. Then the West Indies were touring England, and I picked up snippets from the back page of the paper. It also helped that Yorkshire were, they and Worcestershire were neck and neck for the county championship, so I had a bit of interest about that. As far as the England team goes, I picked up the names of 3 Yorkshiremen who were playing for England at that time. Jeff Boycott, Ray Illingworth, who was the third? I can't quite remember at the moment. Anyway, I knew Fred Truman was a Yorkshireman, wondered why he wasn't playing. Obviously, he was past his best at as far there and was no longer in the test team. I remember hearing about Tom Graveney coming back and batting particularly well against the West Indies bowlers at the age of 39. I remember I got an admiration very early on for Basil D'Oliveira, the South African who escaped apartheid and came over to play cricket for England. Colin Cowdrey was captain, not doing terribly well, and West Indies were wiping the floor, generally speaking, with England. I remember Basil Butcher got a double century in the 3rd test match. But then at the end of July or beginning of August, I think it was, we came over on holiday to England. I stayed with my grandparents who were retired not far from Preston in Lancashire. And very soon after we arrived, the 4th test against West Indies started, even though it was at Headingley. And I'd heard about the players. I wasn't really interested in watching. And the only thing I remember about that was we were having a sort of snack in the kitchen. And my grandfather walked in and said with an air of gloom, "Graveney's out." And that's about all I remember, except England got thumped by an innings. But things began to change gradually. As I say, Yorkshire were winning the county championship. I had an interest in that. Well, I say winning, they were neck and neck, almost just had a slight lead on Worcestershire. I followed the Yorkshire scores on the paper. just one thing I remember in particular about that. They were a match against Essex on a shortened day's play. I remember a close of play, Essex had 98 for no wicket on the board. Opening batsmen Barker and Bear. Again, alliteration maybe helped me remember that. And I thought, well, that was bad for Yorkshire. Well, I'm glad to say Yorkshire went on and won the match anyway. Things really started to change when there was a big, quite a bit of turmoil about the England team having lost 3 of the 4 Test matches. And there was speculation in the newspapers about whether the Yorkshire captain, somebody called Brian Close, whom I hadn't heard before, knew nothing about him at all except the name, and that he was supposed to be a brilliant captain. And somehow, when it was announced that he had indeed been chosen to take over the captaincy of England in the last Test match of the Oval, somehow I developed a sudden real interest in that. And when the day of the match came, I think it was Friday the 18th of August 1966. No, it was Thursday, 18th of August, I think it was 66. I was there at the start of the match, sitting down in front of the television with my grandfather watching. I think my father and brother were there as well. I managed to get a bit of interest in my brother, and later on converted him pretty much to cricket, though he was the guy without Asperger's. So I got the deeper, the stronger interest on the whole. And England made a good start. Well, as long as I'm not boring everybody with the accounts of my memories from the match. I remember Conrad Hunt. I knew next to nothing about him, but commentators on the television thought he was an excellent player, which obviously he was. He was out for 1, and the other opener, Easton McMorris, was blocking most things, playing a very defensive innings, and he was joined by Rohan Kanhai. And Kanhai, remember, he seemed to me to be playing some very exotic strokes. I can't sort of describe them in any way, but I was rather fascinated by watching him bat. And I think these two took the score to lunchtime without any further dismissal. Unfortunately, I missed most of the afternoon's play because my overprotective parents thought if I watched too much television, it would ruin my eyesight. And so they arranged an outing and insisted I went with them. We got back just before the finish to find West Indies had been bowled out for 268, which was quite an achievement by England. I wanted to see Jeff Boycott, the Yorkshireman, bat, but he was already out for 4 by the time we arrived, and we just saw Bob Barber and John Edridge playing out time. Well, keener than ever, I was there the next morning. It wasn't actually on television to start with. We had to listen to the radio instead until it came on BBC One. And by that time, Tom Graveney was in. I think he was soon joined by Dennis Amos, who was making his debut, and watched them bat until almost lunchtime. Amos was out, and it was very interesting to see Basil D'Oliveira come in just before lunch. I remember, though, he hit a 4, I think it was a straight drive for 4 off West Hall, and then got out. Well, I was very keen to see Brian Close bat after lunch. My parents, again, had other ideas and other plans, and I was dragged out, well, not quite kicking and screaming, but certainly unwillingly for the afternoon. And when we got back, we found there had been rather an England collapse, but Tom Graveney, John Murray was standing firm there. Third morning of the match, well, things went brilliantly for England. I was just disappointed Brian Close wasn't in the middle of it, but perhaps he may well have inspired those two to turn in an outstanding performance. They made centuries each. They're supposed to have done it in very stylish fashion. Well, I wasn't really aware of that at the time, but I just remember seeing them bat. When they were out, the score was nearly 400 for 9 wickets, and to everybody's surprise, the last two batsmen, Ken Higgs, John Snow, both chipped in with a 50 each. They put on 128 for the last wicket. I remember my grandfather saying, "Come on, get them out. They won't last long," and so on. He didn't like being proved wrong, so I didn't say anything when they finally took England to a total of 528. I saw the start of the West Indies second innings. Easton Morris out quickly. Conrad Hunt again didn't last very long, and then I was dragged off for the afternoon. And we came back to find that West Indies were really struggling. Seymour Nurse was batting, and he again really impressed me as a batsman. Seemed to be if Tom Braveley and Murray somehow didn't impress me, then Nurse did with his very stylish batting. And Sobers hadn't gone in yet. Well, I've mentioned Sobers before. Of course, I knew that by then that he was the backbone of the West Indies side. He had a brilliant series. And Nurse and Holford saw out the day. That next day was the Sunday. Then on Monday morning, we carried on. Nurse and Holford were in. Holford was soon run out with it through a misunderstanding. And of course, that was to bring in Sobers. And knowing about the history of the series, I said, well, we can expect some runs now with Sobers coming in. West Indies was still behind England. And I remember my father saying, "Oh, well, don't speak too soon." I remember Bill Bowes once bowled out Don Bradman first ball. And, well, a surprise, Sobers faced up to the first ball from John Snow. He tried to pull a short one, and this was actually the absolute highlight of the match. Very first ball, he miscued the shot. The ball bounced off bat and body, and it was pocketed, caught by Brian Close at short leg. And after that, all was anticlimax, more or less. I remember Charlie Griffith put up quite a fight with the bat, but the match was over, I think, before lunch. I wasn't dragged off anywhere. I was able to see the end of the match. West Indies had lost by an innings. England had won under Brian Close. And then I was hooked for cricket for life. I began to follow more closely, and the Yorkshire played Surrey next in the county championship, and they had that on television. What part of it wasn't ruined by rain? I remember they didn't get very far. Yorkshire didn't do terribly well, actually. It was a drawn match, damaged by the rain. And instead, though, they showed us some other cricket. They actually went to Colin Bay in North Wales, where Glamorgan were playing Derbyshire, and we kept seeing that instead. And I remember Alan Jones made 60-odd in both innings, and he became my favourite Glamorgan player. I didn't see much else out of Yorkshire in television. There were more, before the season ended, there were more cricket matches, festival matches, and also the first ever one-day series was arranged. These were never counted as official one-day internationals, I think because they had a rest of the world team taking part. It was a triangular series between England, West Indies, and the rest of the world team, where I got introduced to some of the main names on the world cricket scene. England didn't choose Brian Close for that, which I thought was pretty bad of them. They went back to Colin Cowdrey, but the England team had far more experience of one-day cricket in those early days of that type of the game. than the other players had, and they won the series. And that basically ended my English cricket experience for that year. I remember debating whether to buy a Wisden when I saw it in the shops, and decided to in the end. Well, in the end, I built a big collection of Wisdens. I managed over the years to compile them ever since the Second World War. Before that, they were too rare and too expensive, and I didn't get hold of those. So I was delighted for ACS to fill that gap when they built up their scorecard booklets, which, as I said before, I think went up to the 1950s. That's about all I have to say for that about the moment. I can carry on, if you like, with more about my watching experiences in Zimbabwe and Rhodesia as it was then.
Well, maybe we'll come back to that. I wanted to backtrack a bit and focus in on something you mentioned earlier. You mentioned your Asperger's diagnosis and the slightly negative effect this maybe had on your playing career. I can imagine it might have had a fairly positive, or at least not a harmful one, on your interest in the law and the statistics of the game, in which you now play so prominent a part on the forum. Would you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. Well, I did have an interest, obsessions with other areas. Of I was younger, in junior school, I was interested in astronomy, through to history, but I found these very frustrating because my book knowledge was very. My parents allowed me to carry on with these crazes, as they call them, but they didn't encourage them at all. They didn't sort of very little help in getting books and that sort of thing, or other information, and they were largely starved. Cricket, at least, I did have a feed of information when it came through the newspaper, cricket being an ongoing thing. And it was fortunate also that 66-67 season saw the cricket tour to South Africa of Australia, and it started off with a visit to Rhodesia. I think it was at the beginning of November when the Australians played against East Ground. We had the ground then in Salisbury, as it was then, and I wasn't allowed to cycle to the ground to watch, but fortunately I managed to persuade my father to take my brother and myself to watch in the afternoon, and we saw the Australians play, and from wisdom and so on, I knew about the Australian players. The very first live shot in a first-class cricket match, Bob Simpson, the Australian captain, on-drove a ball from the left-arm seamer. He was out soon afterwards for 8, though. Saw Ian Redpath and Graham Thomas put together quite a useful stand. Ian Chappell came in but was out without scoring. Keith Stackpole scored a run, and that was the end of the day's play. And I followed cricket, gathering statistics, the players' records, keeping a scrapbook of newspaper cuttings of these matches for the Australian tour. And that really got me going in another way. I followed the next English cricket season, of course. From the back of the newspaper, they gave potted county scores. And a big breakthrough came when in a shop I happened to see a magazine called The Cricketer in about July. And that was, of course, The Cricketer, the famous Cricketer magazine, which is still going. I still subscribe to. And that gave me a whole lot of extra information and was a wonderful read. It came out every fortnight, I think it was, in the English season there. And that was a real help and boost to my knowledge.
You're a long-standing member of the ACS. Could you talk us through your relationship with our organization, how and when and why you joined?
Yes, well, I first got the information through the Cricketer magazine. It was, I think, somewhere around May. It was in 1974. It had only been going for about a year or so. And there was a brief write-up in the Cricketer magazine about it, and gave an address to write to if people were interested in joining. So I wrote off pretty smartly to the address, and I was actually put in touch with Rob Brooke then, and that began a long correspondence with him, and developed into friendship over the years, and I've been a member since then. And I was very glad when finally I got to England again, which was in 1985. I was able to stay with Rob for a week or so. Well, it was a couple of sessions actually. We saw, first of all, it was Warwickshire playing against the Zimbabwean touring team. Very handily, it was just, these matches were just to the right time. And then Warwickshire played against Yorkshire, and that wasn't a terribly successful match. I think the first day was washed out because the famous Brumbrella broke down. It happened to choose that match to do it. But I saw Jeff Boycott play for the first time, and he obliged by scoring what turned out to be his 100th century for Yorkshire. And that was a memorable experience. I can't say he was always entertaining, but a great education to watch him bat. And ACS have been a tremendous help to me, actually. Well, there's a lot of water under the bridge, but to cut a long story short, in about 2007, the situation in Zimbabwe for me became virtually unbearable, and I'd done some cricket reporting with Cricinfo before in England, and it so happened I managed to get over to England. A long story about how I got there, which I won't go into, but there was an ACS meeting, which I was just perfectly placed to join, and they allowed me to give a. That was when I met Mike Smith, actually, and all the top brass of the ACS were there, except Rob Brooke couldn't attend, and they let me put my case to them and sort of ask just if they were able to help in any way for me to find some sort of cricket employment in England to keep me going. And I don't know who actually did the work, but they managed to get me fixed up with Cricinfo, which had restarted again. I did work for Cricinfo between 1996 and 2002. Then their finances collapsed. I had been their Zimbabwe correspondent, and along with many other people throughout the world, I had to be dropped because of their shortage of funds. But they were operating again in England, and Martin Williamson was very good. And as I say, somebody from ACS must have contacted him, and he gave me a bit of work to do in England that kept me going 2007, 2008. Reporting on county cricket and a few other matches.
Right, well, you've, with that answer, covered a few of the other questions I wanted to put to you, so I'll move straight to the last one I had down. You mentioned earlier, in fact, that you had a few more choice reminiscences to share about your time as a lover and a viewer of the game. I think actually you mentioned to me ahead of this interview that you had some particularly fond memories of Test cricket and the Currie Cup in our part of the world that you might want to dilate upon.
Yes, well, the Test cricket was in England. That came later. Now, I followed the first Test matches. That end, as I said, were South Africa against Australia, a series, a very exciting and fascinating series, and it ended in South Africa, whom I was supporting because Rhodesia was part of the South African system in those days. And I was supporting South Africa and delighted when they won the series. Then there were some good matches. Let's see, I was the trouble was I was very restricted. Again, my parents unfortunately weren't very cooperative. St Rhodesia in those days, most of their club cricket, virtually all top club cricket was played on Sundays then. And my parents, being very legalistic, refused to allow me to go and watch cricket on Sundays. And the only cricket I managed to watch was when occasionally there was a Logan Cup match played over Saturday and Sunday. When visiting teams came up, we had two Currie Cup matches a season usually. Bulawayo got two, so I had 2 Saturdays to watch Currie Cup cricket, maybe Monday afternoons, and that was just if it didn't rain, because that time of the year is a rainy season. And cricket watching came gradually to start with. In the end, I was allowed to cycle to watch cricket matches, and that really started in was in 1968-69 season. And one memory from that season, our first full day Currie Cup cricket was a Saturday when Natal played Rhodesia, and they batted. For the first time I saw Barry Richards, Trevor Goddard batting, both making good scores. Then there was Lee Irvin and other players later. I saw Mike Proctor for the first time, and also got back part of the time on Monday when Rhodesia, in a very exciting morning's play, saw there was a public holiday actually that Monday. Actually saw Rhodesia's last pair save the follow-on, and in the end save the match against Natal. A few weeks later, Transvaal came to visit, and wouldn't you know it, the Saturday was completely washed out. Rain. Wasn't allowed to go on Sunday, but somehow I forget how I managed it. I got there on Monday. I was able on the Monday to watch the match, and Rhodesia had been batting well on Sunday, and they came in, and I saw what was the greatest over of cricket that I've ever seen, that I remember, the most memorable. Rhodesia had an all-rounder in those days called Eddie Parker, who was a very talented player who unfortunately rarely lived up to his potential, either as a batsman or a bowler. He only scored 150 in his career for Rhodesia. He made a lot of useful 20s or 30s, but only reached 50 once, and that was on this occasion. Bowling, he opened the bowling, but tended to be erratic. And on this occasion anyway, Rhodesia on the Monday morning had scored over 300, and Parker batted really well to score 50 odd. He could be a great hitter of the ball at times, and he scored quite an aggressive 50. And not long before lunch, Colin Blender, Rhodesian captain, wanted to declare and get Transvaal in the hope of taking first innings points off them. And I remember he was signalling from the pavilion, the police ground, to the batsman Eddie Parker, and the last man then supporting him was John Tricos, and saying that he wanted to declare that after this coming over. And this was when Parker came into his very best. The bowler was Frank Dronger, an experienced bowler, an experienced seam bowler. And I read in the newspaper, I think it was, that he'd never been hit for 6 in a first-class match before. He came on to bowl to Parker, and he had a new experience. I think, if I remember correctly, Parker drove his first ball for a superb straight 6, not too far from where I was sitting. I remember there was a dot ball, and there was a 4. I can't remember the exact sequence of things. He edged a 4 through the slips, and then he pulled a ball over mid-wicket for another 6. I think Drummer at this stage got desperate, His next two balls, I think he tried to bowl out of Parker's reach, and they were so wide outside the umpire called 2 wides. The last two balls of the over, brilliant straight driving. One went for a 1 bounce 4. It landed just inside the boundary, and the last one went for a straight 6, not far from where I was sitting. It was 26 runs off the bat in the over, well, not counting the 2 wides. And if that 1 bounce 4 had carried just about 2 yards further, by the way, the police ground wasn't a small ground at all. It was larger than Harare Sports Club. If that had gone for 6-2, it would have been 28 off the over, and he'd have got his name into Wisdom, who in those days had a special section for batsmen who hit 28 or more runs off an over. So that was the most spectacular over I saw. Anyway, a couple of seasons later, we were relegated to the B section. Transvaal B came up, and I saw a very exciting period of play against that. Mike Proctor was playing for us then, and thanks largely to him, that was when he scored his 6 centuries in successive innings, but that was later in the season. In this particular match, well, first of all, first match of the season, Rhodesia against Border. Border, I think, was so traumatised at having to face the bowling of Proctor that they collapsed to 57 all out in their first innings. They actually lost their first 5 wickets for 1 run, which was a no ball. And I saw all of that. In the next match against Transvaal B that I saw, I remember I saw a very exciting session of play as Fred Goldstein opened the bowling against Proctor. And Goldstein, who played for Oxford University, he was renowned as a really aggressive opening batsman. And I could tell he was absolutely bristling, waiting to get hold of Proctor and show he could handle him. And first ball, I remember, Proctor to Goldstein, just blocked. Second ball, bang, smashed to the covers, front foot, 4 runs. Third ball, short ball, Goldstein went on the hook. I'm not sure, I couldn't see exactly what happened. His glasses went flying off. The ball hit something or other. He was a bit shaken, but he survived, and he kept on getting after Proctor. And in 4 overs, I think it was, before lunch, the score was 24 at lunch for no wicket. Goldstein had 23. His opening partner, Elton Chatterton, had 1. And that was a really memorable session of play. I was also there, I was at college in Bulawayo and saw the infamous walk-off match. I won't go into details about that, but except to say that the Eastern Province captain, Laurie Wilmot, said Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, then I think it was 318 to win. Our batsmen did their job in an unusual fashion, and with 19 out of the last 20 overs bowled, Rhodesia needed 6 to win. Mike Proctor was at the wicket, and Wilmot led the Eastern Province off the team and refused to play the last over. He claimed, under a pretext, that 20 overs had been bowled. The umpires awarded the match to Rhodesia, but in an absolutely shocking and indefensible situation, the South African Cricket Association overruled the umpires and declared the match a draw. Owen Pichanik, chairman of the Rhodesia Cricket Union then, was a lawyer himself. He told me personally that when this happened, he went and he had discussed the matter with top lawyers from South Africa. And they agreed that if we took the South African Cricket Association to court, we would have a virtually watertight case. But the Rhodesia Cricket Association, unfortunately, in the South African competition, we were really guests of the South Africans, and there were all sorts of nasty things that might happen to us down the line if we destroy the goodwill between the two associations by taking it to court. And as a result of that, Rhodesia failed to win the Currie Cup for what would have been the only time. Also in those early days, a couple of great things we saw. I saw Gary Sobers play live in Rhodesia. There was what became virtually an international incident. He came for a double wicket competition, and there was tremendous interest in the country for that. We were under a racist government at that time, but under certain conditions, the different races were allowed to play sport together. Sobers was welcome to the country, and there was tremendous interest, and he earned tremendous respect by doing so, unlike all the protesters back home who later caused a lot of trouble for him because of that. So I saw Sobers play live. I can remember well his long looping run-up as he ran up to bowl left arm over the wicket, and his roll of the wrists as he swept the ball round on the leg side, sizzling off drive through extra cover for 4, a brilliant 6 off Mike Proctor over extra cover, and that was a really memorable sight. We also had some international touring teams come. The International Wanderers, there were 2 teams which were captained by Brian Close, so I managed to see him live. In the first tour, I saw him score a few runs, but the highlight I saw was a century by Basil D'Oliveira in Bulawayo when I was there. I was very glad to see that. And also in the Harare match was rather a disaster because water got onto the pitch and the Wanderers had to bat against Mike Proctor at his fastest. And Close stood up to him wonderfully well with all the famous courage he was known at. He got, with the ball lifting at high speed very sharply, he got behind the line of the ball and twice flicked Proctor over the wicketkeeper's head for runs. Unfortunately, it didn't last too long. He got out caught in the slopes. About 3 or 4 years later, he came back with another team, and I was delighted to see him score a century at the police ground in Harare. And what impressed me the most there was this time was the way he used his feet against John Tricos and the slow bowlers there, as he played the spinners so well to reach that. Again, about Test cricket in England. I managed to get back, as I said, to England in 1985, and I was very fortunate. I managed to watch the first Test at Headingley, England against Australia, and the second at Lord's. So that was really good to see an England victory followed by an Australian victory, and the first Test matches I ever managed to see live. I also saw more Test matches in England when I came back, and when Cricinfo employed me when was it, the World Cup 1999. I reported on Zimbabwe for the World Cup. I came over to England and reported on that, and they kept me on to cover the Test matches, 4 Test matches against New Zealand. So it was good to see those. And the following year, when the Zimbabwe cricket tour, I saw Zimbabwe play their 2 Test matches at Lord's and Trent Bridge, and then Cricinfo again kept me on to report on the West Indies series, and that was a great match, especially that Test match at Lord's when all 4 teams, part of an innings batting on the one day, and I think it was in 3 days England won a thrilling finish for that match with Dominic Cork, Darren Gough producing sterling innings which took England to victory. Cricinfoland, county cricket, they cut that for that, and that virtually ended my reporting of county cricket. Very unfortunately, I'd have loved to get back to it again. I really enjoyed county cricket, but I did get a job with Zimbabwe cricket. They invited me back in 2009, and I got a good salary until their currency until their finances collapsed in 2016. I managed to get back 2016. We all got our salaries cut by half. Mine has stayed cut by half. Nowadays, I've got enough money to live by, but I can't get over to England again, unfortunately. It looks like my cricket reporting there has finally come to an end, but I really appreciated it and enjoyed it when it happened.
Thanks, John. It's been a real thrill to me finally to put a face to the name, and I'm sure it'll be a like pleasure to our members with whom you're a much beloved and appreciated figure. Thanks for giving us an hour of your time.
Thanks a lot. I hope it was of interest to them.
Well, it was certainly of interest to me. You brought some long forgotten cricket matches very much to life. You have a flair for description.
Well, thanks very much. Okay then. Right, just a couple of elephants in the room that I forgot to speak about earlier. First of all, 2007, when I was in the UK in exile, so to speak, and needing help in finding cricket employment, Pete Griffiths very kindly, for about 3 years, gave me a job with him, filling in scorecards for Cricket Archive. So that's one thing I will always be extremely grateful to him for.
Oh, so
also, Zimbabwe's first.
We have you to thank then for, in part at least, for how thorough a project Cricket Archive is today.
Well, I only did a small part of it.
Oh well, don't hide your.
And those were minor scorecards actually. He'd send me the original from school teams and that sort of thing, and I'd copy them into the format.
Okay, as you were.
It's also Zimbabwe's first Test victory. Sorry, before the first Test victory, their first Test match, which I was talking about, when the players did so well and had much the better of India. The players have always given a tribute to that to their coach, John Hampshire from England. They said that several of them told me that on the eve of the Test match, they were feeling really desperate, on the verge of Test cricket and not knowing what lay in front of them. But John Hampshire gave them a chat which encouraged them all tremendously, telling them about his Test debut in England in 1969 when he played against West Indies and scored a century on his debut. And that somehow inspired them to realise they could do it. And so they played their best. And as I said, they've always given tribute to John Hampshire for that. Just, I think I forgot to go over Zimbabwe's first Test victory. I was able to see most of it. And it started with Zimbabwe. Well, there was a bit of controversy over the toss, I remember, because the two captains tossed, and Andy Flowers said to me that the captain, Salim Malik, called out heads or whatever it was in a low mumble, and the coin landed. Now, Andy heard him perfectly well, and Salim had called correctly from what he heard, but the match referee didn't hear, and he made two of them toss again, and this time Zimbabwe won the toss. And Salim Malik had only himself to blame for that, because about the previous test that he had played, there was some controversy over that. And then on the ruling came in that the match referee had to be present at the toss. Anyway, Zimbabwe batted first, and they must have thought that was a mistake at first, because the Pakistani seamers were just making the ball swing in circles that morning. The batsmen were all at sea, and 3 wickets fell quickly. Grant Flower hung on by the skin of his teeth with a tremendous fortitude. But then Andy Flower came in, and he really turned the game on its head wonderfully. He actually, in the conditions, he started counter-attacking. I remember some beautiful drives he played, with the bowlers still zipping the ball all over the place. He stayed in, he scored well, and it ended up with him and Grant both making wonderful centuries, Zimbabwe scoring over 500, and then bowling a discouraged Pakistan team out twice. And there was also Heath Streaks bowling there. So the 3 of them, perhaps Zimbabwe's 3 greatest test players, are all making a major contribution to our first test victory. That again was like a dream. Unfortunately, it was a weekday morning when the match ended. I was able to get there, but the crowd, unfortunately, was small. The black population hadn't cottoned on to cricket in those days. And so there was just a small crowd to cheer the players as they ran off the field, all in a line, I remember, shaking hands, slapping hands with the spectators who were there as they left the field. That was a wonderful occasion.
Very good.
End.
Okay.